So, moving on from the last video here, okay, and there's going to be a couple of weird vocabulary terms to kind of wrestle with, but I think ultimately we will find that what Aristotle has in mind works here, okay? And so for Aristotle, right, he thinks that our unique function is to reason and to reason well, and we should habituate our ability to reason, okay? And he thinks that happiness is, again, connected to and is wrapped up in a rational life, okay? Aristotle also thinks that happiness is an activity, and that activity is to reason well, okay? That activity is to exercise. Like, think about exercise, right? When you go and exercise, whether it be run or work out or whatever the case may be, like, you are active. And he thinks the same is true with our mind, that we need to be active in our mind to reason well, okay? That it needs to be practiced, it needs to be habituated, and that happiness is an active, rational life. Now, the next step that Aristotle makes, and this is where the weird kind of vocab comes in, okay, is that Aristotle brings up this very strange phrase, okay, this very strange phrase, and this very strange word that we don't talk about in 2021. It's just not what we do. But he brings up this focus on virtue, okay? And so in various kind of, and I'm not going to go through all the technical bits that are required here, but this all falls in place for Aristotle. About to live a life aimed towards happiness is to live a life in accordance to reason. To live in accordance to reason is to live also the virtuous life. Those are one and the same, okay? And so to live virtuously will better suit us to hit our end goal of happiness. So now the next question then is, well, what is the virtuous life? Okay? The logical framework of Aristotle has been set up then, and it is an overall teleological scheme. Everything we do has a goal, and all things we do have an ultimate goal. This is called happiness. The question then becomes, what is happiness? Aristotle's answer is in terms of human function, or a unique characteristic, which is reason. Happiness is therefore living in accordance to reason. But what does this mean? It does not just mean thinking. Happiness is a contemplative life. Aristotle gives great importance to thinking. However, happiness is a life in accordance with reason. But activity in accordance with reason is called virtue, which is a matter of cultivated habit as well as understandable terms of rational principles. Thus, we have our middle term between abstract happiness and particular activities. Happiness is the virtuous life. And with this general outline, Aristotle turns to the concept of virtue and the particular kinds of virtues. Okay? And so again, I know that's again a bit choppy, a bit choppy, not chompy, choppy, sorry. Okay. A bit choppy, but that's what we get. Thus, we have our middle term between abstract happiness and particular activities. Happiness is the virtuous life, and with this general outline, Aristotle turns to the concept of virtue and the particular kinds of virtue. Okay? And so with that, we now ask questions of how to live virtuously. Because Aristotle thinks if we live virtuously, we're going to live a life in accordance to reason, and then ultimately living a virtuous life is going to better suit us towards hitting our end goal of happiness. So now, the next move is to ask those questions. How do we live virtuously? Okay? And this is how. And I don't think this is going to be wildly revolutionary. I don't think this is going to be mind-blowing, but I ultimately think that it's quite helpful. I think that it's quite centering, if that's the right thought, on how to think about living virtuously. Okay? And this, again, It's coming from the Nicomachean Ethics. Okay. And we get the following. Okay. Sorry. Okay. First of all, then, we must observe that matters of this sort to fall short and to exceed are like fatal. This is plain. In the case of strength, too much and too little. Alike, exercise. Exercise alike destroy strength. And take too much meat and drink, or take too little, is equal ruinous to health. Just so, then, it is with temperance also, courage and the other virtues. The human who shuns and fears everything and never makes a stand becomes a coward, while the human who fears nothing and will face anything becomes foolhardy. So, too, the human who takes their fill of any kind of pleasure and abstains from none is a profligate, but the human who shuns all is devoid of sensibility. Thus, temperance and courage are destroyed both by excess and defect, but are preserved by moderation. Okay? And this is essentially introducing what is called in Aristotelian terms, I've got a cough drop in, is what's called the doctrine of the mean. Okay? And the doctrine of the mean is simply a measuring system, a way to measure how to live virtuously. Okay? So I've got the doctrine of the mean, okay? And Aristotle uses a couple of different maybe strange words here, but on one side, okay, it's literally like a scale. Like when we think of like a scale that goes like that. Okay, on one side we have deficiency, deficiency. On the other side we have excess. Okay. So again, deficiency and excess. Other ways of saying these two words is too little, or too much. And Aristotle thinks that, again, living in defect or deficiency or excess or too much are both what are called vices. Okay? And notice that the root word of vicious, that which is vicious, is the word vice. And Aristotle thinks that in the middle of these two extremes, okay, is what is virtuous. Okay? Virtuous or the mean. Okay? And so literally, like as we think about it like on a scale, on one side you have deficiency, on the other side you have excess, and in the middle you have virtue. Okay? And so what we should be striving for, Aristotle thinks, is finding that middle amount in all that we do. Okay? And this is going to be relative to the individual. It's going to be relative to maybe particular situations, but nevertheless, if we cultivate and practice this kind of metric, then we will live a more virtuous life. Okay? And this is where Aristotle writes, by the absolute mean, or mean relative to the thing itself, I understand that which is equidistant from both extremes, and this is one and the same for all. By the mean relative to us, I understand that which is neither too much nor too little for us, and this is not one and the same for all. For instance, if 10 to be too large and 2 to be too small, 6 then is the mean relative to the thing itself. Okay? And Aristotle goes through a couple of differing examples here, but just to kind of further and just like we'll start most simply. Okay, so again, doctrine of the mean is essentially a guide to rational thinking and virtuous living. Okay. And second, Aristotle notes that it's going to be again kind of relative to the individual. So the example that I often start out with to the individual. Sorry, I think I spelled individual wrong. All right, so what I usually start out with here and I'm just going to try to hold this, is like, let's think about like eating, okay? And let's say I'm really, really hungry, okay? And getting done with class, getting done with teaching, I'm really, really hungry, and I'm going to go, if it were open, I'm going to go over to the Commons and get some food, okay? And like if I go over there and like my state or being is that of being hungry, okay? So through my ability to reason, I'm going to say, all right, I need to eat something. I don't need to maybe like eat everything that there ever has been. And I also don't need to eat nothing, but I need to find that middle amount. Okay? And so let's say like I'm really, really hungry and I go over there and I like, you know, a salad would be too little. Like a small little half salad would be too little. Like I would still be wanting more, right? Because that's obviously deficient. But if I go over there and I order 2 Qdoba burritos and I eat them all, right? I will be in a food coma. I will not be able to move. I will not be able to function well, right? Because I've undoubtedly lived in excess, right? And like my body tells me that, both like physiologically and even like, you know, your brain gets hampered sometimes when you go into those food comas, okay? And so chances are, what I'm going to try to do is find that middle amount, okay? Whatever how hungry I am, maybe like 1 Qdoba burrito is perfect, right? Like I feel full, but I don't feel stuffed. I don't feel like I'm still wanting more, and I've hit that virtuous amount. And so moving forward, right, I want to cultivate that kind of pattern of behavior. I want to replicate it. I want to emulate it. And I know that if I hit that middle amount, I'm going to feel correct about it. I'm going to feel right about it, okay? And that's kind of the nature of virtue, okay? Now, interestingly, if I went and had lunch with, let's say, somebody, you know, one of the offensive line persons on the football team, like, chances are they have a much greater stature than I do, and they have a higher caloric intake because they're a student athlete, right? And so chances are maybe 2 burritos for that person is their middle amount, right? And so again, this is a practiced experience. Like we learn it as we go. But when we find and know that middle amount, which we experience and almost feel intuitively, we want to, again, kind of replicate that in all that we do, right? We want to habituate that in all that we do. And Aristotle, again, we can think about this on very, you know, concrete terms like that with food, but let's think about this in more like abstract terms as it relates to like sleeping, okay? Deprived college students of sleep, chances are that most of you get too little sleep. And so what does that make you feel? It makes you feel groggy throughout the day. It makes you want more sleep because you know that you haven't gotten the right amount. And so, and also like those nights that maybe you like catch up on sleep and you go excessively and you sleep for 12 to 16 hours, right? You're kind of, you know, experiencing deficiency maybe in other areas of your life that you're asleep for. So finding that middle amount that works for you, whether that be 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, right? And habituating that. And again, reason is going to help you out throughout this whole process to reason well. And now we can kind of like even think about this like in more abstract terms, even more so. Think about like a romantic relationship, right? And think about, okay, well, what would it look like to implement this kind of tool in a romantic relationship, right? Perhaps you've been in a relationship where you felt like your partner has not been giving you the attention, or your partner has not been giving you, the value that you think you deserve, which you do deserve, okay? And you've probably been wanting more out of them, and then that again starts tough conversations. But there's also probably been relationships that you've been in where somebody gets really, really into you, right? And it gets a little excessive, and you're like, whoa, let's slow the roll here, right? Let's back up. And so finding this middle amount, finding this middle ground to express love and express kind of needs in a very, again, thoughtful and very practiced and patient kind of way, okay? Think about this with work, right? And this is where I think Aristotle gets kind of challenging, is because like it's like, oh, well, maybe success is measured by having a shit ton of money, right? And you work a lot, you make a lot of money, which is great, right? But also, to what extent are other areas of your life lacking, right? And there's the classic example of somebody that is overworked, that again spends all their time at the job, but doesn't, that doesn't have time for their family, right? And the way that again erodes maybe some of the home life. And so again, what Aristotle gives us here is a focus on balance, a focus on living a balanced life, which frankly I think is really hard to do in 2021, right? I think that there's such a pressure to be kind of excessive, to push the limits, to kind of, especially in like the materialistic way and perhaps in the societal way of like grabbing more, wanting more, desiring more. Aristotle gives us a bit of a reset here. Aristotle gives us a bit of a way of considering that maybe a more successful life is not one of always pushing and always, challenging and always, really, really pushing your limits, but rather perhaps the way to live a good life is to live in much more balance. Okay? And so we take this for what it is, and we take this kind of doctrine of the mean, and we place this kind of in the compartment of the entirety of Aristotelian philosophy that we've been talking about. And we have our end goal of happiness. We use reason in the implementation of the doctrine of the mean, which helps us live more of a life in balance, more of a life in control of ourselves and our wants and our needs and our desires, where we're not swayed by so much excess, where we're not always lacking in deficiency, right? But rather, we have the right amount, right? We have the virtuous amount. And so in that, if we live a life of virtue, which is living a life in accordance to reason, we will be better suited and better able at hitting our end goal of happiness. Okay? And in this way, I think that Aristotle really does give us a much more focused on the here and now, much more kind of pragmatic way of thinking about our lives than we certainly saw with Plato, right? That the way that Aristotle thinks we live the good life isn't by focusing our attention up above, right? But it's by looking at and focusing on what's out in front of us and how to live the good life by practicing, habituating a life of balance, a life of moderation, and a life of rational nature. So I hope you've enjoyed this week of Aristotle, and I hope that, again, as you kind of like think about both philosophers, I'm curious which one resonates with you more, and which one you maybe kind of, take away feeling more swayed by. Because I think they each, Plato and Aristotle, offer really worthwhile ways of thinking about kind of how it is we ought to live. Okay. Hope you are all well, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I will see you next week.